Welcome, everyone, to the New York Alternative Investment Roundtable's October virtual event, China, Theft, Subversion, and Election Interference. I'm Alessandra Tocco, President of the Roundtable, and we're glad you're able to join us this afternoon. First of all, I'd like to take a moment to thank the Roundtable sponsors. I think you can see their names on the screen. We're really thankful to have such a wonderful group of actively engaged sponsors from the industry. So now let me shove off with a few highlights, logistical things. If you haven't participated in one of these virtual events before, I'll draw your attention to the chat function. We would like you to use this function to ask questions of our moderator and panelist. And with that, we'll go right to the event. Today's speaker is a recovering lawyer, as he has informed us, author, columnist, Gordon Chang, who has lived and worked in China, Hong Kong for almost 2 decades, and most recently in Shanghai as counsel to the American law firm Paul Weiss. Before that, he was a partner at international law firm Baker & McKenzie's Hong Kong offices. Gordon is a Daily Beast columnist and the author of The Coming Collapse of China and Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World. He is a frequent contributor to publications ranging from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal to the National Interest. He frequently appears on CNN, Bloomberg, CNBC, and PBS, among others, and he has given numerous briefings in Washington and other capitals. Today's discussion will be moderated by Bob Atkinson, co-head of prime brokerage at Murray Asset Securities USA. Robert has experience managing prime brokerage, capital introduction, agency execution, and research distribution businesses. He has also served as a member of a GP at a hedge fund and on the advisory board of several money management firms. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Robert.
Hey, Ali, thanks very much, and welcome, everyone. I think we have a very exciting program ahead of us with our good friend Gordon Chang. Gordon has been with us several times before, most recently back in March. And for those of you who were able to join in on that call, Gordon gave us, I think, some very prescient insights into what we might be able to expect in the future. And at that time, one of the concerns we had was that we may be getting Gordon too late in the cycle, which is to say we thought that maybe the virus would be over before we had him appear back in March. Well, of course, we were dead wrong about that. We did have Gordon on, and Gordon gave us, I think, some very interesting insights into the global supply chain, the extent to which we were quite reliant on China, and what we might expect down the road. As Ali said, today, Gordon's title is China, Theft, Subversion, and Election Interference. Now, this is a very bold and provocative subject/inference, so I'm sure that all of our viewers will be keen to see how Gordon makes his case. Just a reminder, Gordon will be answering my questions for approximately 45 minutes, and I see it's about 1:04. But I do want to call your attention to the button. I think Ali mentioned this. You do have the ability, and I see we already have some questions lined up in the queue for Gordon, but you do have the ability to, at any time, send a question into Gordon, and we'll make sure he gets it at that point. So, Gordon, it's great to have you back again. And obviously, the world has changed quite a bit since your last appearance at the Roundtable. For one thing, the virus has taken an especially human toll. No question about it, and probably no worse than, no place worse than the United States. And it's certainly spilled over into our economic life. And depending on how you view things, the outlook remains unclear. Another thing is that 2020 is an election year of significant consequences. But one thing certainly has not changed since the last time you appeared. And that is the controversy about China continues to swirl about in our media, our domestic and economic lives. Question is China a rival or is it an enemy? So let's get to it. Maybe a good place to begin, Gordon, is for you to talk a little bit about China's Belt and Road Initiative, both on land and sea. Now, this initiative has broad geostrategic and economic implications, not just for China, but potentially for the rest of the world, especially at a time when it appears as if the United States seems to be pulling back from global engagements. So, Gordon, how do you see the progress with Belt and Road, and what is its likely impact on the world?
Well, thank you very much, Ali, and thank you, Robert. And your question about whether China is a competitor or an enemy, that was actually Susan Page's question at the vice presidential debate.
Yes.
And we noticed that both the vice president and the senator just absolutely refused to answer that question. So I hope that we can sort of get to that, because I believe that it's sort of the darker answer is the appropriate one. Belt and Road shows China's global ambitions since President Xi Jinping, General Secretary Xi Jinping announced that in 2013. I worry a lot about China. Belt and Road is one of the things I generally do not worry about, and largely because I practice law in Hong Kong. I didn't do infrastructure work, but my firm did. And I can tell you that everything that was bankable has already been built by the private sector. And what China is doing is throwing a lot of money, some of it its own, some of it other people's money, into these grand projects, which I don't think, for the most part, have a payback. And what we have seen recently is countries not being able to pay back. Most famously, you have Sri Lanka with the Hanbantota port, which China took over. But now we're seeing a wave of defaults in Africa. And I think that, people talk about debt trap diplomacy. Well, debt trap diplomacy traps the creditor as well as the debtor. And I think basically Beijing is overstretched. Now, there are parts of Belt and Road that I think are dangerous. So for instance, China is building a $3 billion container port in Freeport, which is like 87 miles east of Palm Beach. This makes very little economic sense. And I think we're going to end up seeing the Chinese Navy 87 miles east of Palm Beach with a permanent base there. But, with exceptions from that, I'm very happy to see Beijing throw a lot of good money after bad projects.
Well, do you see any benefit? So for example, I've read where some commentators believe that by China building this infrastructure, and maybe you could speak for a moment about the scope of Belt and Road from a geographic standpoint, right? So it stretches from China across Central Asia into Europe, and it goes into the Indian subcontinent, and it reaches Africa. And it's both on land and at sea. So it seems as if they're building a lot of infrastructure with the idea in mind that it will facilitate commercial flows.
Well, yeah, and that's the whole idea between Belt and Road when it was first announced. That was to connect China's coast with the Europe. And so you had the Belt, which is the railroads through Central Asia, and the road, which is the sea route through the Indian Ocean. But this sort of gives you an example, I think, of how misconceived the Belt and Road is. So for instance, they've got all these railroads going through Central Asia. And yeah, I think Kazakhstan eventually will be an important market, but it's not now. And it's certainly not it doesn't justify the amount of money they're putting in. What China's been using those railroads for are to transfer and transport their military. So we've seen a number of these large exercises in Central Asia, and China's using its new railroads to transport tanks. So I can sort of see that as a justification, but not really an economic one. Got to remember, we've got climate change. Climate change means that the Arctic ice cap is melting. The big shipping companies have started to realize this, and they do these trial runs connecting China to Europe, going across the north of Russia. Now, for instance, Maersk did this about a year ago. Now, within, half a decade, there are going to be regular shipping runs across that north coast. that means all of China's investments from an economic point of view through Central Asia are going to be sort of made obsolete, because ships can travel between China and Europe as fast as the railroads can, but because it's shipping, it's going to be so much cheaper. So you have the example of just misconceived spending on infrastructure. They got a digital Silk Road. That could very well be important. It depends upon the future of Huawei, which is now up for grabs. But when we look at this, China's putting a lot of money into projects. It's never going to get it back. And in Beijing right now, I think the best test is that people don't see Belt and Road as successful. They see it as one mistake after another.
I see where Morgan Stanley estimates that by 2027, China will have spent about $1.3 trillion on Belt and Road. And just as a frame of reference and source of comparison, the United States has spent roughly $6.5 trillion since 9/11 on its various military activities in the Middle East and Central Asia, just to put some perspective on that. What do you think about, you mentioned the transport of military vehicles. I see that recently you penned an op-ed piece in Newsweek about the recent conflagration that took place, or I guess it was back in May, between Indian forces and China in the northernmost part of the country. And I guess they don't have clear boundaries, and it's more or less an old-fashioned frontier. But as I read it, the Chinese basically stepped over the line of control, as it's referred to, into Indian territory.
The line of actual control.
Line of actual control, and there was a considerable loss of life. The Indians, of course, may be a little reticent to engage China. I guess they suffered a pretty significant setback in the early 60s, but it appears as if India was able to recover that territory. Do you think China is ready to step up or to play at that level from a military standpoint?
Yeah, the answer is no. The answer is the image of the Chinese military is a lot bigger in our imaginations than it is in actual real life. And this series of incursions starting in early May, I think just perfectly illustrate this, because you had the Indian political establishment was caught napping. So China was able to grab a lot of territory in Ladakh, which is high in the Himalayas, 3 separate areas of incursions. But then this turned into one setback for China after another. So for instance, June 15th, China, in a premeditated act, kills 20 Indian soldiers. And, China looks belligerent. But really what happened on that night was India killed probably, India was caught completely unaware, killed probably 43 Chinese soldiers, and some say as many as 60. So even though China had first mover advantage, they were humiliated. And what was even worse, at the end of August, India launched a counteroffensive, took back a lot of the territory that they lost in early May. China then counterattacked, and their counterattacks were disorganized and they failed. And again, it just showed that China just does not have the ability, at least its ground force, doesn't have the ability to engage in effective military operations. This goes back to 1979, where they wanted to teach Vietnam a lesson, as they said, and the Vietnamese, with their third string army, beat China's first string. So this is really a setback. But there's a more important setback for China rather than just talk about military. The Indian political establishment, Indian population was outraged by the death of 20 Indian soldiers. And what they have done is they've effectively gone after the Chinese economy. So for instance, they initially banned TikTok and 58 other Chinese apps. Then in a second round, they banned more Chinese apps. This is a big deal because it took billions of dollars off of the valuation of ByteDance, TikTok's owner. then, Huawei, which had been allowed to compete in the 5G trials in January, has now been shadow banned in India. And India is potentially the world's biggest telecom market. Chinese contractors, which had actually won bids, are now being tossed out of their contracts. So India is really going after China in a way that is meaningful, in a way which is robust. And I don't know what China has really gained in the Himalayas. What I'm really concerned about is that having faced a fierce Indian foe, Xi Jinping realizes he's not going to be able to get any further victories in the Himalayas. So he's going to go after somebody else. That somebody else is probably going to be one of our friends or allies, which means that we could be involved. So, right now we've got China, which is probably going to lash out someplace. But ultimately, this is whatever tactical victories India has gotten, this is ultimately a strategic defeat, because what China has done this year, and especially in the Himalayas, it's gotten India, Japan, Australia, and the United States, the Quad, to actually start working together as an effective grouping to contain China. So really, at the end of the day, China has suffered one setback after another, and it really hasn't gained anything.
So it would seem then that the Indo-Pacific strategy being pursued by the United States and its allies will be an effective counterweight to China in that region. You would agree?
I agree. I agree. It's not because we want an effective strategy. It's not because the Trump administration has an effective strategy.
Right.
It's because China is forcing other countries to be resolute. And so, yeah, we've got an effective strategy, I guess you could say, which is now working together with our friends and allies to contain a belligerent Chinese state.
Okay. And Gordon, if I can just go back to one of your comments about Belt and Road, we have a question from the audience. And the question is, aren't many of the obligations, so this is not a Marshall Plan where
Right.
China basically grants money to these countries and to activities in those countries. But basically, to use your term, it's a debt trap, perhaps. And most of these countries have obligations and therefore political relationships to benefit from. What is your thought on that?
Well, China has been able to, been very effective in signing countries up on Belt and Road projects. And it's gotten some benefits. For instance, it has its offshore military base in Djibouti. It's only one. And Djibouti, by the way, is a big Belt and Road debtor who very well may not be able to pay China back. But China was very successful in signing countries up. But right now, there's a lot of anger at China because these projects are not panning out. They're not working out from an economic point of view. They're not paying anybody back. No one's prosperous. And people in African countries are really angry that China got these projects through big, large payments to African leaders. So, there's this anger issue, which is not, maybe in the short term, intermediate term might not have much of an effect, but long term, this public opinion it is going to have an effect in Africa.
Okay, and we have another question in too, Gordon. Why has the world been so lenient with China after December 31st? I'm just trying to distill the question down a little bit further. Basically, they misled the WHO. What is your thought on that? Do you think that's a valid concern?
It's an extremely valid concern. We got to remember what China did. China actually, we don't know where this bug came from, although there's more and more scientific evidence to say it's engineered. But that's a debate among scientists. We're not going to get a definitive answer, if ever, at least for a couple of years. But there are some things that we know, Robert. We know that China lied about the contagiousness of the disease. Chinese leaders knew it was highly contagious. They convinced the world it was not. They got the WHO to propagate the narrative that it was not. And at the same time, Xi Jinping leaned on countries not to impose travel restrictions and quarantines on arrivals from China, while at the same time he was locking down his own country with travel restrictions and quarantines. So in his mind, he knew these measures were effective, and he had to know that by getting other countries to keep their borders open, by the way, with the help of the WHO, he knew that he was spreading disease. So people may not like this term, but this was murderous. And because we've got 1 million people who have been killed, I think you can say this is mass murder. Question is, why hasn't this affected elites in countries, apart from President Trump, who is pissed as hell? And I think it's largely because, for the same reasons why China has been able to get away with a lot of unacceptable behavior over the course of years. And that is because people want to integrate China into the international system, because some people have financial benefits that they get from Beijing. Countries at especially a rocky time like now don't want to do anything that would further drive their economies into the ground. And so, China is getting a free pass. But we know, going back to public opinion, that there have been all of these surveys, including Pew, which just issued one recently, that shows that opinion about China is at historic lows. And this eventually will translate into policy. But China's problem right now is that as we learn more and more about the coronavirus, its standing, I think, is going to be lower and lower, because we're going to find out even more stuff about what Xi Jinping did, and it's going to make China look even worse. So I don't know why. You've got this, Bill Gates sort of view that is still dominant, but that can't stand the test of facts. And as I said, as facts come out, China's standing in the world is going to get lower and lower.
That was a pretty strong statement you made earlier about the virus, and the follow-up comment about the WHO. Can you explain why the United States has been the principal backer of the WHO? As I understand it, China has paid very little into the WHO. Why would the Chinese have such an outsized influence with that organization if that were the case? And if what you say is true, that in other words, people are basically listening to their own vested interests and pursuing their own vested interests. So what was the vested interest of the WHO in not alerting the rest of the world to the dangers of this virus, if in fact they knew?
Yeah, well, they did know, by the way, because senior doctors at the WHO knew from the get-go that this disease was human-to-human transmissible. Maria von Kerkhoff, who's one of the most senior doctors there, in I think it was April 13th press briefing, actually talked about what senior doctors at WHO thought about the disease when they first heard about it. But that had no effect on Dr. Tedros and Bruce Alwine, the number 2 or number 3 at the WHO. It's a great question. Why didn't Tedros or Alwine listen to their own doctors? Well, Tedros was a committed socialist. Beijing got him elected as director general of the organization. So, that might explain it. Not everything not everything in the world is going to be money driven. I think Tedros is actually a real believer. Got to remember that in, I think it was January 31st, maybe a little bit, few days earlier, Tedros and Xi Jinping actually talked. And Tedros's takeaway from this was that China's treatment of the coronavirus, which was then really bad, Tedros said publicly, this showed the superiority of socialism. Now, first of all, that comment was completely irrelevant to the WHO mandate, but it showed you where Tedros was thinking, that he really wanted to propagate the notion that, China has a superior model of societal organization. So, I'm not in Tedros's head, but that seems to me about the only explanation that makes sense to me. But the point is, you're absolutely right, Robert. The relative contributions to the organization had no effect on the way the organization actually operated. And by the way, I think Trump was right to withdraw from WHO because although the doctors and other specialists and professionals at the organization do great work, their work is completely nullified because of the political leadership there. And you can't reform that organization unless you get Tedros and Allwine and a number of people to actually leave.
So Gordon, we have a follow-up question from the audience, and it goes something like this. Given what you just said, why is it then, about the WHO, why is it then that the Trump administration is having such a difficult time getting that message across to the public here and abroad?
First of all, I don't think the public listened to what von Kerkhoff said, as I just mentioned before. If they did, I think they'd be outraged. But part of it is, we just went through the UN General Assembly meeting. You had the 75th anniversary of the founding of the organization. Multilateralism has become religion. And so, the WHO embodies this notion of multilateralism. So yeah, people say, well, yeah, of course we need the WHO. But the problem is that, unfortunately, we need a new global architecture in health. Now, I'm not saying that and Trump is, when he withdrew from the WHO, said, we're going to put together, an alternative. I don't know, even if Trump is reelected, I don't know if he would be successful in doing that, but I do know that getting the WHO out of the way is a precondition to having an effective health architecture throughout the world. So, people just won't listen. Americans didn't listen, for instance, to Osama bin Laden and what he was saying about us. We just ignored it. We're very good at ignoring the facts when we really want to. And I think we're doing that in connection with the WHO. There's a lot of stuff that Trump says is wrong, but what he says about the WHO is 100% spot on.
So, Gordon, can we take from your last series of comments that you're not a particular fan of multilateralism?
I love the idea, but I think that the way that it's been operating in practice has not served the world. I mean, look, we're all one human species. We're divided into countries. And so the question is, well, why don't we all act together? Because we're all humans. But the point is that, unfortunately, there is evil in the world. And we are divided into these countries. And so multilateralism hasn't worked. The idea behind the UN, for instance, is that the world's great powers can cooperate to implement solutions. That's a nice idea, but it doesn't work when some of the evil actors are sitting on the UN Security Council. So unfortunately, we've got to figure out a new way of doing things. And remember, the UN is not the first stab at this. That was the League of Nations, which, by the way, this would be the 100th anniversary of the founding of the League of Nations. League of Nations in the 1930s could not deal with the aggressors of its era, Imperial Japan, Fascist Italy, Nazi Germany. So the organization failed. The UN is in that same sort of process of failing because, the core ideology of multilateralism is not providing security. And it's not providing security when you have bad actors on the Security Council. So the way that multilateralism is now in practice, no, I'm not a fan of it. And I think we need to start over. I like the idea of countries working together, but not the way that we've got it structured at the moment. It's just not working.
So just to pivot slightly on that, from that point, do you think that the United States might have had greater success in pushing its agenda with China had they enlisted allies who in common cause? So, for example,
yes.
I know you would agree with this, that one of the criticisms of China has been that they are helping to take jobs away, to reduce the wealth of this country. It's been said that they are taking intellectual property. But they're not just doing it to the United States, these people would argue. They're doing it to the European Union as well as Japan. So wouldn't we be in a better position with China if we, as I said, went at them in common cause, as opposed to doing this on a bilateral basis? at the same time we criticize allies?
Yes, the answer to that is obviously yes. And the question, though, then is how do you do it? Because, we've had a succession of presidents, both parties, liberals, conservatives, across the political spectrum, who have actually bought on to that very idea, but they weren't effective in dealing with China. So obviously something's got to be done. Now, I think President Trump could have done a much better job in enlisting allies, and he hasn't done that. And he's been criticized for it, and I think criticized fairly. But let's remember that he's the first president who has broken this whole notion of engagement, which for half a century hasn't worked, especially recently. And he's actually done things to affect China. So, yeah, I'd like to put Obama and Trump into a bag, mix them up, and come up with a combination of the two traits that they have. Obama's ability to work with other and Trump's idea of what to do. But unfortunately, I can't do that.
So, Gordon, we have a question from the audience here. Can you address your view of Apple and other U.S. companies building their products in China?
Dangerous. First of all, got to remember, look what China's done. And it's not just spreading coronavirus to the United States. It's not just stealing hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. intellectual property. It's also taking the proceeds of commerce and investment, and it's building a military which is configured to fight America. So I don't think that we should be enriching a hostile state. And remember, China last year, May of 2019, actually ran a piece in People's Daily, which is the most authoritative publication in China, which declared a quote unquote people's war on the US. So we don't need to have to speculate whether China's an enemy or not. So we should not be building anything in China, especially with electronics, because China can build chips, which without our knowing about it, can turn off our, in mid-flight and stuff like that. So, yeah, we shouldn't be doing it. It's just wrong.
Well, I've seen some people say, I was going to say, I've seen some people say that if we forego those opportunities, then the Japanese and the Europeans will fill that void. What do you think about that?
I think that they probably would, but the United States needs to lean on Tokyo and others not to. But ultimately, there are things that are just right and wrong, and I don't think that we can say we should be supporting a regime that is openly hostile to Americans. This is just wrong. So we need to have effective diplomacy to make sure that our allies and our friends and other countries don't support a country that has declared us to be an enemy. So this is just effective diplomacy that we need to engage in. And we haven't done what we need to do, but this is what our ultimate goal should be: to get our companies out of China, to get China out of the United States, and to defend our society.
So I'd like to get your reaction to this. Almost a year ago in the Harvard Business Review, Professors John Graham and Benjamin Leffel wrote a piece entitled, "Is China Actually Stealing American Jobs and Wealth?" And they looked over several categories, including purchasing power parity since 1985, the unemployment rate since that time, the prevalence of bribery or briberous practices in China, piracy piracy of content, and the number of patents being granted to Chinese inventors or Chinese inventors with American partners. And the general view was that China has not been damaging American interests. In fact, what has resulted is a partnership, in a sense, that is, in their words, the most synergistic bilateral relationship in world history, bringing peace along with mutual prosperity. Now, if we go back to 1985 and we look at what's happened in the world since then, there has been a fair amount of peace, I think we could say. The unemployment rate in the United States has actually remained fairly steady, with the exception of the period right after 9/11, as well as the financial crisis in 2010, and of course, most recently with the virus. But otherwise, it's been fairly consistent. Purchasing power parity in this country has tripled since the mid-'80s. Now, of course, it's gone up leagues greater in China because they had much more to go. Piracy seems to be, according to the Software Alliance in the United States, has been decreasing steadily. Piracy, Chinese piracy, that is. So I just want to get your thought on that. Do you think there's a valid other side to this story?
I mean, is Chinese piracy on the decline? Well, it could be. But we have the March 2018 report of the U.S. Trade Representative. We have the report of the Blair-Huntsman Commission of 2013, plus its 2017 update, which, substantiates the notion that whatever, the trend is, China is stealing hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. IP, and they estimate something in the $300 to $400 billion range a year. So it's still substantial.
It was 300. The number I saw was 250 to 600. And what I noted was that, right, I think it was Science Magazine, and I can't think who else, but basically said that's obviously a wide range of numbers. So what's the real number? And the experts claim that it's a very difficult proposition to measure with any degree of accuracy.
It's very difficult to measure. And I think it's virtually impossible to do it. But yeah, I mean, industry experts do talk about $600 billion a year. The Blair-Huntsman report talks about a lower number. They don't actually give a number, but what they do is they say that it equals about U.S. exports to Asia, and so you can backtrack it. But when you're talking about, even if you go to the lower end of the range, and I've seen numbers like 125 billion a year, that's still robbing America's future. And that's just not acceptable. So yeah, the trend line might be better, but nonetheless, this is a grievous wound nonetheless. We know that China's been engaging in apart from the criminal theft of U.S. intellectual property, we know they've been engaging in predatory trade behavior, which is a violation of their World Trade Organization obligations. You just go down the list. China's behavior is, we haven't been successful in what we thought would happen when China acceded in 2001. So, my sense is that the United States just needs to decouple. I mean, we need to decouple for a number of reasons that we've talked about today. But I just don't see that when you have a country like China, which has been challenging us across the board and competing in ways, challenging us and competing, that's okay, that's normal. But competing in the ways that they do is just not acceptable. It's not consistent with the notions of the world as it should be.
So let's talk for a moment about some specific examples. And I know you've done a lot of work, and you have, I think, great insight into several situations, one being Huawei and TikTok. So what is your view of the situation as it relates to Huawei?
Well, in the beginning of this year, or maybe if you go back a year ago, everyone was saying that Huawei had won the 5G race around the world. But recently, that doesn't look to be the case. Yes, Huawei has wired the third world, but in the developed world, it is suffering one setback after another, thanks to a pretty concerted and determined policy on the part of the Trump administration. So it's not just the UK, which is perhaps one of the more known examples. You're seeing shadow bans in France. Germany's going to shadow ban. And this is going to occur. But the other thing is not just countries turning their back on Huawei and understanding the danger that it poses. You have President Trump's designation of the company and its subsidiaries under the Commerce Department's entity list. And that has actually affected Huawei because it has two lines of business. Its more important line of business, funnily enough, is its smartphones. That's where it gets its primary growth and profits. And everyone says that that Huawei is going to run out of Kirin chipsets for its smartphones by the middle of next year. And of course, it doesn't have access to the Google Store, which makes its phones really unmarketable outside of China. For its networking gear, they have maybe a couple years of supply of chips, but the Trump administration has been very effective. So this has been good policy on the part of
Could you, for just a
Washington.
moment, just speak a little bit about the entity list and what that is?
Yeah, the Commerce Department has a list of companies where if you have transactions, either product sales or licenses, that are covered by a certain set of regulations, and I forget the exact name of, you have to get a prior license from the Commerce Department. And Huawei was added to the entity list in May of last year. Trump administration then wasn't serious because it granted a series of waivers, but it got serious this year. And that's the reason why Huawei is having so many problems, because they need to get permission. And it's not just US companies need permission. What the administration did this year was it said that anyone who makes chips, silicon, semiconductor chips with US chip making equipment needs to get a license from Commerce. So this entity list designation has actually gotten to the point where even SMIC, which is China's largest chip fab, actually has stopped supplying chips to Huawei because they're afraid of what Wilbur Ross would do to them. So,
well, I see. So it's Samsung, it's Taiwan Semiconductor. So there are several leading electronics companies in the world who no longer do that type of business with Huawei. So
right.
the Commerce Department has quite long reach here.
It has, yeah, companies at this point, semiconductor companies are not outlaws because, they're just so big and they can be hurt. These companies had fabulous second quarters because Huawei was buying chips like crazy in anticipation of the entity list rules actually coming into effect. And you're going to have TMIC, SMIC, Samsung, Qualcomm, all these companies are now going to have problems in the third quarter and certainly the fourth quarter because they're not selling to Huawei.
Interesting. So another question in from the audience, Gordon. If the U.S. divests away from China manufacturing products for the U.S., should that manufacturing be sent to other Southeast Asian countries or go to Mexico? If it went to the U.S., would U.S. consumers pay 100% more for these products? Very interesting question.
Great question. Yeah. As a practical matter, well, we've seen Vietnam, for instance, do very well as manufacturing for various reasons has started to leave China at the low end. I would like to see manufacturing come back, of course, to Mexico, but also to the Central American republics. And the reason is, you got to remember, Central America was devastated when manufacturers left Central America for China when China acceded to the WTO. And that's why we have all these caravans that are pressing up on our southern border, because these societies have been destabilized. If low-end manufacturing comes back to the Central America, then those societies become stable, when we don't have these problems. Now, USMCA really creates an important block. So Mexico, I'm very happy to see manufacturing that was once in China or once elsewhere go to Mexico. And of course, I'd like to see manufacturing come back to the US. Because you got to remember, this is not just a question of the prices at Walmart. You have families in the United States, whole communities that have been devastated by all of this. And so we as a society would do better if, for instance, we paid more at Walmart, but we didn't have fentanyl problems and we didn't have people in, families just totally ruined by all of this. So to me, it seems it's very important that we bring some manufacturing back to the U.S. And also that we help our neighbors to the south, not only Mexico, but Central America as well.
And Gordon, these are all very laudable points, but don't you think that when these jobs come back, if they do come back, let's take the United States first, they're not going to be the jobs that left these shores 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. There'll be a high automation or robotics component. And I think that begs a question, has this society prepared well enough to take on that assignment? Do we have enough skilled workers to do that work? Because it won't be the same work it once was.
Yeah, the answer is no to every question you asked.
Sure.
No, we haven't done enough. You know, this thing about automation is absolutely fascinating because, you know, a robot in Kentucky is just about as cheap as a robot in Guangdong. So automation is actually going to erode China's advantage. And that means we are going to be manufacturing more here. But you're absolutely right. You know, we have a workforce that doesn't have the right skills. And we're going to have to look at that. And the Trump administration just has not done a great job in that area. But I have to say, neither did its predecessor.
Sure. And so that brings us to the election. If Biden wins the presidency, how do you see him dealing with these issues? And how do you see him dealing with all the issues you just raised with respect to China?
A couple things. Let's take Biden out of the equation for a moment. Every US president, first time into the White House, gives China a grace period. They want to see if they can cooperate with China. Biden will be no exception. Trump gave Xi Jinping a grace period of about 13, 14 months. 2017 was a love-in between China and the United States. And it was only when Xi Jinping didn't reciprocate Trump's gestures that Trump brought down the hammer, starting, let's say, in March of 2018. So Biden will do the same thing. I think, though, that the competition between China and the US and the challenges that China is posing right now don't give us really the luxury of having another grace period. Biden's view, and by the way, China has really been trying to support his efforts. They've been trying to unseat the president. So you can imagine what Beijing thinks about this. You know, Biden's view is that we should not oppose China's efforts of development. We should just strengthen ourselves. I have no problem with strengthening ourselves, and we should be doing that. And Trump has not done a good job in that regard. Neither has his predecessor. But the point is, the United States can't strengthen ourselves effectively if we don't stop China's malicious attacks on our economy. So I think that the Biden team has a view which is outdated. That was the view that had prevailed, since Nixon and Kissinger went to Beijing, and it just hasn't worked. So although it sounds good to the ear, like multilateralism, for instance, it's just not working in practice. And unfortunately, you got to deal with China in a way which nobody wants to. I don't want to do this stuff. I'd like to have great relations with China. But
Gordon, wouldn't you say that, I was going to say, wouldn't you say that the China that we have before us today is certainly not Nixon or Kissinger's China, that it has developed in ways that no one could have imagined back at the time they opened up relations with China?
Yes. I mean, China's done unimaginably well. It's done well because it's had a very benign external environment. It's had a very supportive US and other countries. But those days are over. And so I think it's going to be much more difficult for China, even in a Biden administration, because, reality is going to mug President Biden.
Sure.
And also there's political pressure going on. Got to remember something we haven't talked about. China's committing crimes against humanity. With the exception of mass extermination, China's doing everything the Third Reich did, and a few things in addition. And this is going to affect views on China. And it's going to affect, the ability to cooperate with China. Because people like me are going to be asking, should we have a relationship with a country that is involved in slavery, genocide, killing of minorities, all these things? The organ harvesting report, by the way, was just issued 24 hours ago. This is hideous and grotesque. And, a lot of Americans look back and say, how could Britain and France deal with the Third Reich in the 1930s? Well, people might ask the same question about Americans in the 2020s. So these are moral issues that have to have an effect, because we cannot maintain an amoral foreign policy. It never works. Even Kissinger, a proponent of that, realizes that there has to be a values component in our foreign policies with regard to China. And China is doing things which are just grotesque.
I assume you're referring to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang?
The Uyghurs, the Kazakhs, the Tibetans, and indeed others as well. But you got mass internments, you got all of these things going on. I mean, we have this conversation about racism and slavery right now in the US. Well, just imagine what the Chinese are doing right now. It's a thoroughly racist system. It's interning minorities in these concentration camps. It's using them as slave labor, by the way, for some American companies as well. And indeed, its policies to limit Uyghur births are genocide. They're actually murdering people in China right now, infanticide, which has been documented. I don't know how you can maintain a relationship with that type of country. And by the way, it's also Christians. I mean, though Christians are not being, to the same degree, but it's only a matter of time before they do that.
So I see that the Holy See has attempted to reinvigorate
extended
relations.
the agreement.
Yes. And what exactly was that agreement about?
That agreement was who was going to appoint bishops in China. That's the 2018 agreement, which China violated almost as soon as it was signed. But the Pope has extended it, or will extend it. It's not exactly clear what's going on right now, but he will do that. And the question is this working out for the church? And a number of cardinals have said, no, it's not. But the Pope is absolutely determined to do it.
And Gordon, in our remaining time, can you tell us a little bit about what happened down in the Chinese consulate in Houston to provoke its closure by the U.S. government? Yeah. And tie that in with your comments about the election, please.
Yeah, the State Department said it closed the Houston consulate because it was being used as a base for espionage. And I'm sure that's the case. But there are been persistent reports that Houston was also used as a base for other activities, especially providing logistical and financial support to protesters. Radio Free Asia actually issued a story which said that a intelligence unit of the People's Liberation Army actually based themselves in the Houston consulate. And there they used big data to identify Americans likely to participate in Black Lives Matter and Antifa protests. And then it sent them videos on how to riot. And that was, they used TikTok for this, and they used engineers from Huawei. So though the State Department doesn't say this, I think that's the reason why they picked Houston rather than one of the other 4 consulates to close. Because we know that the other 4 consulates have been also engaged in espionage and activities that are inappropriate under the Vienna Convention. But I think Houston was just more flagrant than the other ones. And that shows you that China's been involved in what's going on this year. Now, there's a lot of other evidence that suggests that. People are now trying to tie all the pieces together, but China was involved not just in publicity campaigns and the rest. They were actually involved in subversion and acts that actually constitute acts of war.
Wow. So TikTok, let's talk about that for a second. But how is TikTok and Huawei connected?
Well, they were connected in Houston. TikTok has got the world's most sophisticated, commercially available artificial intelligence. It just knows what you want, and it delivers videos that you want to see, and it doesn't deliver the stuff that you don't want to. So you've got.
But don't users have to give permission under the privacy statutes to access this data?
Sure. Yeah, of course. But TikTok's been engaged in activities which are not covered by those consents. So we know that TikTok has been surreptitiously downloading software on user devices. Apple made that claim that they did it. Actually, TikTok did it twice. Once in April and once, I think, in July or August. So they haven't stopped. TikTok has undoubtedly been surveilling users, taking information and sending it over to China. TikTok has also been mishandling the information of minors. I think there's a consent decree on that. And we have seen that there are indications that TikTok has been used to foment violence in the United States. But, you know, even if TikTok were a model citizen, which I don't think that it is, but even if it were a model citizen, China doesn't allow US apps in China. So why are we allowing Chinese apps in the United States? This is a simple reciprocity issue.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Question from the audience. What can we expect if the president is reelected in terms of China policy?
You know, I have heard the spectrum. I have heard that he's really going to knock the crap out of China. I have heard the fact that he's going to let China go because he's got reelected. I'm not in the president's head. I tend to think that he is going to be resolute. Even if he's not resolute, he's got a number of officials around him who are. So for instance, you got a Secretary of State who actually believes what he's doing. So it's going to be tough for China if the Secretary of State is the guy from Kansas. I tend to think that the president really believes that China is engaged in extremely bad behavior. I don't have a pipeline in, but let me just say, if you look at the external stuff, Trump, everyone was saying, was cruising to a re-election victory. And they were saying that at the beginning of this year. Coronavirus hits, and the polls say he's going to lose by historic margins. So if somehow he manages to pull this out, and I'm not saying that's impossible, but if he manages to pull this out, he's probably going to be very angry at China. He said he's very angry at China.
Yes.
I believe him.
Yes, and it would appear as if, to your point, what remains in terms of advisors in the White House are economic nationalists. You mentioned Secretary of State Pompeo. There's Peter Navarro. Guys like Gary Cohn, the multilateralists, the free traders, don't seem to have any standing there whatsoever. I mean, they're not in the White House for that matter. So it does appear as if the president believes what he says when it comes to this matter. No question.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, you have Steve Mnuchin there, but, you know, whoever is Treasury Secretary is always going to be, let's not disrupt the flow. I mean, that's what Treasury Secretaries do. But apart from Mnuchin, you've got a cast of characters who actually
Yes.
believe that, you know, the United States needs to take effective measures against China.
So, Gordon, I see that Ali has joined us. So it's been a fun and very quick 55 minutes that we've had together. So thank you so much for joining us again. We look forward to visiting again with you in the future. And on that note, I'm going to turn it back over to our president, Ali Taco.
And yeah, thank you very much, Gordon. Very for sharing your perspectives on China, Asia, geopolitics, the global economy. You've given us quite a bit to think about. Our next roundtable event or monthly call, which will be October 27th at noon, it's entitled Gold at 10,000, Sooner Than You Think. We are also having a roundtable networking event on October 29th at 5:30. You'll see those notices in your emails. We hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Stay safe, healthy, and enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks.